Captain Sarah Chen knew the risks of deep space reconnaissance, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. The bridge of the U.S. Pathfinder filled with warning klaxons as three massive crystalline ships emerged from fold space, their faceted surfaces refracting the light of the nearby gas giant into deadly rainbow patterns. Multiple bogies, unknown configuration. Lieutenant Rivera's voice carried over the chaos. Energy signatures off the charts. Captain. Sarah's fingers danced across her command console, already plotting emergency maneuvers. The Pathfinder was a scout ship, built for speed and stealth, not combat. Emergency protocols, all hands. Divert power to engines and get me a trajectory out of here. But the crystalline ships moved with impossible precision, cutting off their escape vectors one by one. Their surfaces shifted and realigned like living geometry, weapon ports opening like flowering fractals. They're not broadcasting any signals, Communications Officer Park reported, his usual calm cracking. No response to hails. Wait, getting something. It's just mathematical sequences. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the pattern displaying on her screen. Prime numbers. The universal language. But this wasn't a greeting. It was a calculation. Their chances of survival reduced to cold equations. The first blast caught them off guard, slicing through their shields like they weren't even there. The Pathfinder's hull screamed as exotic energy weapons carved through their armor plating. Hull breach, decks 3 through 5. Engineering's voice crackled through damaged speakers. Core containment failing. Sarah watched her crew working frantically at their stations, pride mixing with terror. They'd trained for first contact scenarios, but this was something else. These beings, these crystalline ships, they weren't interested in communication or conquest. The mathematical precision of their attack spoke of something worse. Extermination. All hands, abandon ship. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but Sarah knew they were out of options. Emergency pods now. That's an order. The bridge crew hesitated for just a moment. Enough time for Sarah to see the loyalty in their eyes, the unwillingness to leave their captain. But training took over, and they moved with practiced efficiency toward the escape stations. Sarah remained at her station, buying time with what weapons they had left. The Pathfinder's guns were mere pinpricks against the crystalline hulls, but every second she could distract them was another second for her crew to escape. The ship lurched violently as another blast connected. Through the view screen, Sarah watched escape pods launching, small and vulnerable against the vastness of space. The crystalline ships ignored them, either considering them irrelevant or saving them for later. Either way, it gave the crew a chance. Core breach imminent. The computer's warning was almost serene compared to the chaos around her. Sarah ran for the last escape pod, the deck shifting beneath her feet as the ship began to break apart. The pod's launch was a blur of acceleration and warning lights. Through its small viewport, Sarah watched her ship, her home for the past 3 years, tear itself apart in a spectacular explosion. The crystalline ships barely seemed to notice, already turning their attention elsewhere. The pod's emergency beacon activated automatically, but Sarah quickly shut it off. She had seen enough to know that rescue wasn't coming. Not yet. Her pod tumbled through space, its limited thrusters firing automatically to avoid debris, carrying her toward the nearby moon. Its surface was a patchwork of ice and rock, riddled with deep crevices and caverns. Potential shelter, if she could survive the landing. As the pod entered the moon's thin atmosphere, Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who were these beings? Why had they attacked without provocation? But the moon's eternal twilight cast strange shadows across Sarah's makeshift camp. 3 days had passed since the crash, and she learned more about her crystalline enemies than she ever wanted to know. They called themselves the VAR, or at least that's what she'd pieced together from intercepted transmissions. Their language was pure mathematics, devoid of the messy imperfections of organic speech. They had established a base on the moon's far side, their structures growing like geometric cancers across the frozen landscape. Sarah watched them through salvaged binoculars, documenting their patterns and movements. The Var didn't sleep, didn't eat. They simply existed, expanding their presence with mechanical efficiency. The cold was her constant enemy, seeping through her thermal suit despite its best efforts. The pod's emergency supplies would last another week, maybe two if she stretched them. But Sarah's real focus was on the device spread across her lap, a jury-rigged sensor array built from pod components and pieces of her shattered comm unit. "Come on, show me your secrets," she muttered, adjusting the frequency scanner. The Var communicated through crystalline resonance, complex vibrations that carried data through their bodies like light through fiber optics. Understanding those frequencies might be the key to fighting them, or at least surviving them. A sudden spike in the readings made her freeze. The nearest Var patrol was passing closer than usual, their crystalline forms catching the starlight. Sarah held her breath, though she knew they couldn't hear her from this distance. Her hideout, tucked into a deep ice fissure, had served her well so far. The patrol moved with perfect synchronization, their faceted bodies shifting and realigning with each step, but something about their movement caught Sarah's attention. Each time they passed certain mineral formations in the ice, their crystalline forms seemed to shudder almost imperceptibly. Sarah's eyes widened as she checked her sensor readings again. The local ice contained trace elements that resonated at frequencies close to the Var's communication bandwidth, not enough to harm them, but enough to create interference. An idea began to form, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but potentially game-changing. Working through the moon's brief night cycle, Sarah modified her sensor array into something new. The pod's emergency beacon became a frequency generator, its power cells barely able to contain the energy she was pushing through them. She had one shot at this. If she was wrong, she'd give away her position for nothing. Dawn brought the patrol again, right on schedule. Sarah waited until they were directly above her position, then activated her device. The effect was immediate and devastating. The crystalline beings shattered like struck glass, their perfect geometric forms exploding into countless glittering shards. Sarah barely had time to celebrate her discovery before alarms began blaring from the Var base. She quickly packed her essential gear, including the frequency generator and her notes. They would be coming in force now, but she had something they didn't expect. Proof that they weren't invincible. Moving through the ice caves, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The Var's crystalline nature was both their strength and their weakness. Their bodies channeled energy with incredible efficiency, but that same property made them vulnerable to the right frequencies. If she could get this information to the fleet, a massive explosion rocked the moon's surface, nearly knocking her off her feet. The Var were being thorough, systematically destroying any place that could serve as a hiding spot. Sarah pressed deeper into the cave system, her path illuminated by the emergency lights she'd salvaged from the pod. The caves were a maze of ice and rock, formed by ancient volcanic activity and countless millennia of tidal stress. Sarah had mapped some of them during her hidden observations, but much of the network remained unexplored. She needed to find a way to broadcast her discovery, but the Var would be monitoring all frequencies. As she descended deeper into the moon's crust, Sarah discovered something unexpected. The caves were amplifying certain frequencies naturally, creating standing waves that resonated through the ice. If she could tap into this phenomenon, maybe she could turn the entire moon into a weapon against the Var. But first, she needed to survive. The sound of crystalline movement echoed through the tunnels, search parties methodically sweeping every crevice and corridor. Sarah checked her makeshift weapons' power cells. They were nearly depleted after the morning's test, and she didn't have the resources to generate that kind of energy again. What she did have was knowledge. Knowledge of the Var's weakness and of the moon's natural resonance. Now she just needed to find a way to use both before the crystalline beings found her. As she moved deeper into the caves, Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. The Var thought in absolutes, in perfect mathematical certainties. But humans? Humans thrived in chaos, in the spaces between certainties. And Sarah Chen was about to introduce the VAR to chaos they never could have calculated. Deep in the moon's ice caves, Sarah worked by the dim light of her salvaged emergency lamp. The makeshift transmitter in front of her was a mess of cannibalized parts. Components from her escape pod's communications array merged with pieces of VAR technology she'd scavenged from their shattered patrol units. The crystals from the destroyed VAR still held residual energy, pulsing with a faint inner light that cast strange patterns on the cave walls. Sarah had discovered that these fragments maintained some of their transmission properties, even after being separated from their original forms. It wasn't just technology. It was practically a part of their biology. A distant rumble shook loose ice from the cave ceiling. The VAR were getting closer, their systematic search patterns bringing them deeper into the moon's crust. They had been at it for hours, their crystalline forms perfectly adapted to the cold and darkness that Sarah struggled against. "Just a little more time," she muttered, her fingers numb despite her thermal gloves as she made final adjustments to her hybrid transmitter. The device was crude but clever. It would use the VAR's own crystalline technology to amplify her signal, broadcasting on frequencies that human ships could detect while hiding in the background noise of the VAR's natural communications. The cave system had turned out to be a perfect transmission network. The ice formations acted as natural waveguides, and the trace minerals she'd discovered earlier created resonance chambers throughout the moon's crust. If her calculations were correct, she could use these natural features to broadcast her message across light years of space. A sharp crack echoed through the tunnels. Closer this time. Sarah's hands moved faster, connecting the final circuits. She had encoded everything she'd learned about the VAR into a compressed data packet. Their crystalline structure, their resonance frequencies, their weaknesses. Most importantly, she included the specifications for the sonic weapon she'd improvised. Come on, she whispered, powering up the transmitter. The VAR crystals pulsed brighter, their energy feeding into her jury-rigged device. The cave walls began to vibrate slightly as the transmission built up power. The first blast caught her by surprise. A section of the cave wall exploded inward, showering her with ice fragments. Through the breach, she could see the geometric forms of VAR search units, their crystalline bodies glowing with internal energy. Sarah slammed the final power coupling into place and hit the transmit button. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The caves filled with resonant energy as her signal bounced through the moon's natural amplification network. The nearest VAR units shuddered, their perfect forms showing signs of stress. But they weren't shattering like the patrol had. These units were better protected, their crystalline structures reinforced against sonic attacks. They advanced into the cave, their movements deliberate and threatening. Sarah grabbed her backpack and the most critical components of her transmitter. The signal was broadcasting. Now she just had to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. She threw her last makeshift sonic grenade, the device detonating with a high-pitched whine that cracked but didn't shatter the nearest VAR unit. The tunnels became a maze of chaos and crystalline pursuit. Sarah used every trick she'd learned about the cave system, leading the VAR through sections where the natural resonance would interfere with their coordination. Her remaining power cells were nearly depleted, but each time the hunters got too close, she used them to generate localized frequency bursts that forced the VAR to retreat. Hours blended together in the darkness. Sarah's muscles screamed from exhaustion, her lungs burning in the thin air. The VAR never tired, never slowed. They simply adapted their search patterns, learning from each encounter, closing in with mathematical precision. Finally, Sarah found herself cornered in a large cavern. The ceiling soared away into darkness, massive ice columns stretching from floor to roof like ancient pillars. Behind her, a deep crevasse dropped away into the moon's core. Ahead, the tunnel mouth filled with the approaching glow of VAR search units. The transmitter in her pack was still broadcasting, using the last of its power to send her message into space. Sarah checked her remaining equipment. One power cell, barely charged, and a handful of components she'd stripped from her original sonic weapon. The VAR entered the cavern in perfect formation, their crystalline forms creating a beautiful but terrifying light show as they advanced. Their mathematical language filled the air, a symphony of calculations that Sarah had learned to recognize as a death sentence. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. Sarah wasn't looking for an escape route. Her eyes were fixed on the massive ice columns, her mind racing through calculations of her own. The cavern's natural resonance, the structural weakness of the ice, the depth of that crevasse behind her. Sarah Chen smiled as she began assembling her final weapon. The VAR thought they had her trapped, but they were about to learn another lesson about humanity. Sometimes the best way out was down. Admiral Elena Torres stood on the bridge of the UES Hyperion, her expression grim as she studied the tactical display. The compressed data packet they'd received had seemed impossible at first. A transmission using modified VAR frequencies, carrying detailed intelligence about an enemy humanity had barely begun to understand. Signal origin confirmed, Lieutenant Commander Hayes reported, his fingers dancing across the sensor controls. It's coming from the third moon of the gas giant. Heavy interference, but the data signature is definitely human. The Pathfinder's last known coordinates, Torres murmured. The scout ship's destruction had been the first warning of the VAR threat. Now, somehow, someone had survived and managed to send them exactly what they needed. The Hyperion led a battle group of 15 ships, the fastest response force they could assemble. Initial encounters with the VAR had been devastating. Human weapons seemed to barely scratch their crystalline hulls. But this survivor, this ghost in the void, had changed everything. Engineering reports sonic weapon modifications are complete, Captain Rodriguez announced. We've adapted the frequencies from the data packet to our main weapon systems. Every ship in the fleet is being updated now. Torres nodded, her mind already plotting strategies. Time to arrival. 10 minutes to battle space, Hayes responded. VAR forces detected around the moon. 3 capital ships and multiple smaller craft. They appear to be conducting some kind of search pattern. Deep in the moon's caverns, Sarah's makeshift plan was already in motion. She had positioned her remaining power cells strategically around the massive ice columns, each one modified to emit a specific resonance frequency. The VAR advanced cautiously now, having learned from their previous encounters that human unpredictability made them dangerous. Your persistence is inefficient, the mathematical language of the VAR translated in Sarah's salvage decoder. Submit to optimization. Sarah's response was to trigger the first power cell. The resonance wave struck the nearest ice column, creating a harmonic pattern that shook the entire cavern. Cracks appeared in the ancient ice, spreading like lightning bolts through the crystalline structure. The VAR hesitated, their perfect formation showing the first signs of uncertainty. Their bodies vibrated in sympathy with the resonance, forcing them to adjust their molecular structure to compensate. That's when Sarah triggered the second cell, then the third, each one carefully calibrated to a different frequency. The overlapping waves created interference patterns that the VAR couldn't adapt to quickly enough. The cavern became a cathedral of sound, ice, and crystal singing in devastating harmony. In orbit, the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly into attack formation. The VAR capital ships reacted instantly, their geometric forms shifting to combat configuration. Multiple enemy contacts, Hayes called out. They're moving to engage. All ships, implement sonic weapon protocols, Torres commanded. Focus fire on the nearest capital ship. Let's test our survivors' intelligence. The Hyperion's main guns fired, modified energy beams carrying the precise frequencies Sarah had discovered. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The VAR ship's crystalline hull resonated, stress fractures appearing across its perfect surface. Direct hit. Rodriguez reported, excitement breaking through his professional demeanor. Enemy shields are ineffective against the modified weapons. We're actually hurting them. Below in the cavern, Sarah's plan reached its crescendo. The ice columns, weakened by the overlapping resonance waves, began to collapse. The VAR units scattered, their perfect coordination broken by the chaos of falling ice and conflicting frequencies. Sarah ran toward the crevasse, her last power cell clutched in her hands. The cavern was collapsing behind her, thousands of tons of ice crashing down. The Var pursued, but their crystalline forms were vulnerable in the resonance-saturated environment. Above, the space battle had turned decisively. The human fleet, armed with their new sonic weapons, tore through the Var defenses. The crystalline ships, for all their technological superiority, had no defense against weapons that turned their own nature against them. "Enemy fleet is retreating," Hayes announced. "2 capital ships destroyed. The 3rd is attempting to escape." "Not today," Torres said firmly. "All ships pursue and engage. Don't let them warn their reinforcements about our new capabilities." In the cavern, Sarah reached the edge of the crevasse. Behind her, the Var closed in, their mathematical language now filled with urgent calculations as they realized her intent. She triggered the final power cell and jumped. The resonance wave, amplified by the collapsing cavern, shattered the remaining Var units. Sarah fell into darkness, her trajectory calculated to reach a lower cave system she discovered during her explorations. It was a desperate gamble. But then, everything about her survival had been desperate gambles. As she fell, her salvaged communicator crackled to life. Through the static, she heard a human voice, the first in what felt like ages. "This is the UES Hyperion to Survivor. We're detecting your position. Hold on, we're coming for you." Sarah smiled as she activated her emergency beacon. The Var had made their final miscalculation. They thought humans were inefficient, unpredictable, weak. They were right about the unpredictable part, and that's exactly why they were losing.